In August of 1996, a 26-year-old artist named Maria Farmer called the FBI in New York City. She told them that a man named Jeffrey Epstein had stolen photographs from her studio, photographs she had taken of her younger sisters as reference for her paintings. One of her sisters was 16, the other was 12. She told them she believed that Epstein was selling these photographs, and she also told them that Epstein had asked her on at least one occasion to go and photograph other young girls at swimming pools. She told them that her 16-year-old sister had just returned from a ranch in New Mexico, where Epstein had crawled into her bed, and she told them that Epstein was now threatening to burn her house down if she ever said anything. The agent who took her call hung up on her, and Jeffrey Epstein continued his horrible deeds for the next 23 years. This is a story about Jeffrey Epstein's Zorro Ranch in central New Mexico, about 7,500 acres of high desert, 30 miles south of Santa Fe, in the shadow of the country's two largest nuclear weapons laboratories, about what was built on the ranch and who built it, about the family who sold Epstein the land, a family who also happened to be very connected to New Mexico politics. This is also a story that weaves in something else we've been talking a lot about: scientists and this country's national labs. This is also a story about a British media tycoon named Robert Maxwell, whose daughter, in 1992, introduced Jeffrey Epstein to a scientific network her father had spent 40 years building. A network the FBI had already been investigating in New Mexico 8 years before Epstein bought Zorro Ranch. This is a story about the network of power and influence that these New Mexico scientists gave Jeffrey Epstein, the Nobel laureates he funded, the geneticists who edited his cells, the physicists who flew to his island, and the artificial intelligence researchers who came to his ranch. It's also about the politicians he visited, the prosecutors who knew, and the federal officer who signed the closing papers on the ranch, and then spent the next 7 years not investigating the man whose name was on them. Everything is sourced to sworn statements by Epstein's own victims, to the words of the United States Attorney General and the former Attorney General of New Mexico. Unfortunately, what we are talking about doesn't come from wild theories or guesswork. This is the truth unfolding. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein. Now, if you've been following my channel, you know I've spent a lot of time on a different story: the unexplained deaths and disappearances of scientists who worked for NASA, the military, and for the United States National Laboratories. Now, when I started on this video, this Jeffrey Epstein, a ranch in central New Mexico, I expected it to be a completely separate project, a different subject entirely, but it's actually not. It's the same. It's all connected. It's the same handful of labs, the same federal jurisdictions, the same intelligence networks, the same political families, the same story of prosecutors who don't prosecute. And I'll be honest with you, when I started seeing this overlap, I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been. Because as it turns out, we are not really talking about separate stories. We're talking about a tale as old as time, a story about high-level people in our government doing things they can't afford to have us know about, and about the apparatus they've built over the decades to make sure none of us ever find out. This video is about Jeffrey Epstein and a piece of land 30 miles south of Santa Fe and what was done there, but it's also a chapter of a story I've been trying to tell in pieces for a long time. And honestly, seeing what's happening in New Mexico and what happened in New Mexico with Jeffrey Epstein, knowing what happened in Florida with Jeffrey Epstein, and seeing it sort of mirrored in New Mexico and knowing what was going down in New Mexico, I made a Instagram story and put it out and to let people know that I was looking into this. And I said, I don't even live in New Mexico and I'm pissed. I would be very, very angry. And if you do live in New Mexico and you don't know what's going on, you're going to find out today. And I too hope that you're very angry, because you should be. In fact, all of us should be, no matter what state we live in, because there might be a microscope on New Mexico right now, but I guarantee you stuff like this happens in every state. So we have a lot to talk about today, but before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Aura Frames. You know what's funny? I have approximately 47,000 photos on my phone. Well, maybe not exactly 47,000, probably more, but there's enough that every time my phone tells me I'm running out of storage, I'm somehow shocked. And the thing is, some of my favorite memories are sitting in that camera roll, which I figure out when I have to figure out which ones I want to delete, but nobody ever sees them. And a lot of the time, I forget they're there until I'm going through to delete them because I'm out of storage. Pictures from family vacations, random photos of the kids being ridiculous, the dogs doing something weird or cute, dinners with friends, little moments that seem ordinary at the time, but now I'm really glad I captured them. And that's why I love my Aura frame. Well, actually, I love my Aura frames because I have two, one for at home and one for at the office. The Aura frame is a Wi-Fi connected digital picture frame that lets you add photos and videos directly from your phone. So instead of those memories disappearing into the abyss of your camera roll, they're actually out where you can enjoy them. And one thing I really love is how easy it is. I can add photos from anywhere. So if I'm traveling, at CrimeCon, filming, or just out doing life, I can upload new pictures instantly, and then they appear on the frame right away. So when I take a picture and I'm like, oh, this is a good one, I don't have to wait until I'm with the frame to make sure it's actually loaded up into the frame, because then I'll forget. I can just add the pictures through the app, and then when I sit down at my desk on Monday morning to work, the pictures are already there. So I sent a bunch of pictures to the frame when I was in Vegas at CrimeCon this past weekend, and when I got back to work the following week, it was such a nice reminder of all the fun we had. And the setup is incredibly easy. It takes just a couple of minutes using the Aura app, literally just a couple of minutes, and then you're done. The photos also look amazing quality-wise. Honestly, unless you catch the image changing, it looks like an actual framed photograph sitting in your house, not a screen. With Father's Day coming up, I also think it's one of those gifts that's genuinely personal. You can preload it with family photos before it even arrives. You can add a message. You can give somebody an entire collection of memories instead of just another thing to put on a shelf. And you can connect to that person's frame so you can add more photos as you go. This is really good if you're not living close to your loved ones, and you can kind of play little jokes on them. I talk about this before. My sister and I do this with my mom, and we put goofy pictures on her frame, and she gets really upset. Or you can heart the pictures that someone else is adding to your frame. And that's really what I like most about it. We take more pictures than ever before, but somehow we end up looking at them less unless we put them on social media. Aura gives those moments a place to actually live instead of getting buried in your phone or put out there to the entire public world. Named #1 by Wirecutter, you can save now by visiting auraframes.com. For a limited time, viewers can get $35 off of select frames with code stephanieharlowe. So that's AURA frames.com and use promo code stephanieharlowe. Don't forget to support the channel by mentioning me at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. And if you're looking for a Father's Day gift that's thoughtful without being complicated or cheesy, definitely check it out. I'll have the link in the description and on the screen. Thank you so much to Aura Frames for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Okay, as always, to understand what happened at the end, we have to go back to the beginning. And in this case, where we're going to start here, the beginning is actually the property itself, the infamous yet elusive Zorro Ranch. In 1993, Jeffrey Epstein purchased 7,600 acres of land in southern Santa Fe County near the unincorporated community of Stanley, about 30 miles south of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Here's a very interesting tidbit that we'll delve deeper into later. I saw it reported that Zorro Ranch happened to be located right between Sandia National Labs and Los Alamos National Lab, which is true. But it gets even weirder than that, because if you put in all the coordinates and you look at it on a map, Zorro Ranch actually sits at the apex of a near perfect right angle triangle formed by itself, Los Alamos, and Sandia. So at one vertex of the triangle is Los Alamos, the birthplace of the atomic bomb. At another vertex is Sandia National Laboratories, the United States principal nuclear weapons engineering site, and then Zorro Ranch sits at the third vertex. So that is a striking architectural relationship. And it's not the kind of thing that happens randomly when you have hundreds of square miles of New Mexico to choose from. This is going to come back in, and it's important. But let's talk about where Epstein got the New Mexico land from. He purchased this land from the King family for a reported sale price of $12 million, and that sale also included the state grazing licenses that the Kings had been operating on the adjacent state trust parcels, 2 state parcels to be exact, totaling approximately 1,244 acres of state trust land, roughly 2 square miles. So we will talk about that in more detail soon. But what's important to know now is that this additional land was not for legitimate purposes. There's only one legitimate purpose, really, that you can have these kinds of state lands, leased or sold to you, usually leased. And that's for grazing, right? But that is not what Jeffrey Epstein used this land for. This land, this additional land, it was a buffer zone meant to create a wide perimeter around Epstein's New Mexico compound, making it impossible for anyone to get close to Zorro Ranch from the south, east, or west without crossing land that Epstein controlled. So the land is high desert plain with sparse vegetation, rolling grasslands, basalt outcroppings, and the El Creston geological formation. The closest residential neighbor is miles away. There are no public road passes within sight of the main compound that Jeffrey Epstein would eventually build on this land, and from most directions, the property is invisible from the nearest public roads. Now, once the compound itself was completed, Zorro Ranch was like an independent small town, a place that Epstein survivor Virginia Giuffre described as looking like Disneyland. So you would enter the property through a gated entrance off a remote rural road, a gate that was monitored by an on-site full-time caretaker. From the entrance, a long private driveway, several miles long, ran through the open grassland towards the main compound. Now, just past the entrance, the first thing you would encounter was basically a small operational complex that the DOJ documents call Ranch Central. This is a self-contained operational village of 10 structures. And this is where a lot of the Zorro Ranch staff would live because Epstein didn't want them with him in the main residence. So it's got a 7-bay heated garage, the ranch office, which served as the administrative headquarters for Zorro Ranch. They even have a firehouse, a real firehouse with a fire truck, operational. There's small residences that were used by staffers and managers, and then various utility buildings and equipment sheds. A few miles away from Ranch Central, understand I'm saying a few miles away, normally in a big sprawling kind of residence like this, you might see the caretaker be, down the driveway, but then you can see the main residence from the caretaker's house. No, a few miles away from Ranch Central, set apart and approached by a separate driveway, sat the main house where Jeffrey Epstein would live when he was in New Mexico. It's hacienda style, 3 levels, over 30,000 square feet. This sprawling mansion is roughly twice the size of the next largest private home in Santa Fe County and among the largest private residences in the entire state of New Mexico. Now, the interior was designed by Albert Pinto, the late Paris-based designer known for old world extravagance, whose client list included Middle Eastern royalty. It is worth noting that Pinto also designed Epstein's Manhattan townhouse and also his Paris apartment. I guess you could say the style is old world opulence and luxury. I think it's tacky. I think Epstein had very overblown, tacky tastes, kind of, if you remember the scene from the Titanic, where the people on the Titanic were looking at, I think it was Molly Brown, and they were like, ugh, new money. It's giving very new money. But anyways, the interior decor includes objects ranging from European antiques and a gilded framework to displayed Native American artifacts, including petroglyphs that Epstein had physically extracted from the surrounding land. See, remember, I said part of Jeffrey Epstein's large acreage included a section of El Creston, which is a basalt geological formation where the native peoples had carved petroglyphs into the rocks over the centuries. And these carvings were estimated to be between 350 to 600 years old. And Jeffrey Epstein, there's a lot of him emailing back and forth with people and talking about this, and he's asking oh, how can I polish these petroglyphs? He actually went out and had these things dug up, basically so he'd use them as decoration, which I find to be very weird and offensive. Like I said, these rocks have been in the land for 300 to 600 years, and you want to put them in your tacky house. Now, at least one boulder bearing petroglyphs was photographed in Jeffrey Epstein's yard at Zorro Ranch, and archaeologists who examined the photo said the rock showed signs of transport damage, meaning it had been removed from where it had stood for, hundreds of years, maybe more, and then dragged to its new location, which, I don't know, like I said, it feels wrong. In the life of Jeffrey Epstein, where a lot of what he did was wrong, this isn't like, the worst thing, but it's definitely on the list. I don't like it. Another thing that I thought was strange, looking at the blueprints and the layout of Zorro Ranch, the main residence, this enormous 3-story home has only 4 bedrooms, even though it's over 30,000 square feet. Why does that feel weird? It feels weird. Why only 4 bedrooms? That's a huge house. Now we're going to talk about this because the people who have been there, Epstein's victims, and even some people who worked for him, said that there were secret rooms, and especially in the basement, there were like enormous rooms as big as houses that were basically surveillance rooms, that there were camera systems set up all over the house, all over the grounds, and these rooms in the basement were set up to basically be like government level monitoring stations with security in there looking at the cameras 24 hours a day, not for security, but according to these people who knew about these rooms, for the purposes of blackmailing guests and other people who would stay at Zorro Ranch. Now, there's also a great room in the Zorro Ranch main residence, reportedly larger than a standard American house, featuring a massive fireplace and a hideous ornate chandelier. There's a kitchen that Sotheby's described as being big enough to hold an entire cooking staff. There's another living room separate from the enormous great room. There was an office, a formal library, and then in the basement, there was a large indoor swimming pool, jacuzzi, and full gym, along with these other enormous rooms that, according to Maria Farmer and others, were computer rooms used for surveillance and spying. Now, looking at the plans, the blueprints, there are these 3 large rooms that are labeled mechanical rooms on that basement floor, but I don't know what you would need 3 mechanical rooms that were that size for, especially when a lot of the infrastructure, like the power for Zorro Ranch and internet and all of that stuff, was located in the utility buildings by Ranch Central. So I don't know what you would need mechanical rooms that were the size of houses and why you need 3 of them. But according to Maria Farmer, they are not mechanical rooms. They were computer rooms meant for spying on people, guests that stayed at Zorro Ranch, like Prince Andrew. Now, beyond the main house, the property includes a separately scattered series of structures, like a 3-bedroom lodge in its own private area. This was designed as a guest house for visiting friends or business associates, also equipped with cameras, allegedly. An off-grid log cabin, self-contained on its own remote stretch of the property, capable of operating without connection to grid water or power. So it's basically saying like this is an off-the-grid cabin, as if you were in the wilderness, but really you're not, because, just a mile away or so is this enormous 30,000-foot sprawling mansion. So I'm not sure what you would need a cabin like that for. There have been speculations, and there's, pretty sick speculations, but it's worth noting from what I can tell and from what I've read and heard, an off-grid cabin on a property this size means it was reachable only by a private internal road and effectively invisible from any other area on the estate or from any other outside kind of perspective. There was also an 8-stall horse stable, a tack room, a barn. There's a house with a wraparound porch surrounded by a picket fence, which we can see in DOJ photos, and I don't know what this house was for. It looked very out of place in the high desert of New Mexico. It didn't match any of the other surrounding architecture or design. Just incredibly weird. Why would you need this kind of guest lodge and then a remote cabin and then also this weird house with a picket fence? There's, once again, speculations, and ideas about what happened there, but the Zorro Ranch compound also had a tennis court, a large glassed-in kitchen garden, gurgling fountains. For the most part, it was heavily manicured and landscaped. Like I said, when Virginia Giuffre went there, she wrote in her book that it reminded her of Disneyland. So on a separate flat section of the property, accessible by a different internal road, Jeffrey Epstein had built a 4,400-foot private airstrip, long enough to accommodate small business jets, as well as an aircraft hangar and a helicopter pad. And apparently there were 2 planes and 1 or 2 helicopters there at any given time. Now, the airfield made the ranch effectively self-sufficient for transport, right? People could fly in and out of Zorro Ranch without ever passing through a public airport, customs, or commercial security screenings. This is the single most operationally important physical feature of the compound, and the reason that no comprehensive visitor list has ever really been compiled. Because with other places like Little St. James, Jeffrey Epstein's island, they had to go and fly, and land in an airport or fly through customs of some kind because they were going to a different country. So we had flight logs and things like that. But here, we don't. The property's airstrip never logged its arrivals into any public manifest system. Now, I do want to dive deeper into this property, this sprawling compound, this little Epstein village, and I want to discuss some claims that have been made about specific features there. But first, I want to talk about something important. I want to talk about the multiple people who effectively, in my opinion, allegedly don't come from me. The multiple people who allowed Jeffrey Epstein to function and operate in New Mexico for so long. I also want to tell you that multiple people have come out, testified under oath, and talked about their experiences with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell at Zorro Ranch, claiming active abuse was happening there, active abuses of minor girls as well as women. Yet Zorro Ranch was never investigated or searched. Well, I guess it was sort of investigated, and they claim they're investigating now, but not really on both counts, in my opinion. Don't come for me. And this is important, so let's go over it. To understand the Zorro Ranch institutional failure, you first have to understand the contrast, right? So after Jeffrey Epstein's July 6, 2019 arrest at Teterboro Airport, federal law enforcement moved very quickly. The FBI raided the East 71st Street townhouse on July 8th, Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan townhouse, and this happened the same day Epstein's indictment was unsealed, and agents recovered safes containing hard drives, CDs labeled with subjects' names, photographs of nude females, surveillance equipment. The FBI also raided Epstein's private Caribbean island on August 12, 2019. This was 2 days after his death. Agents documented and removed surveillance equipment, photographs, recording infrastructure, files, and then a second federal search team returned later to the island. In that same federal action, Little St. Jeff, the smaller island, that was also searched. Epstein's Palm Beach mansion was searched repeatedly, going back to the 2005 Palm Beach police investigation, and federal officials went through it during the 2007-2008 Florida case. Epstein's Paris apartment was reportedly searched by French authorities in coordination with United States requests. So by the end of August 2019, every major Jeffrey Epstein residence had been entered by law enforcement, except one, Zorro Ranch in New Mexico. Now, per reporting in the Santa Fe New Mexican, the FBI told people, colleagues, in the weeks after Epstein's death that the FBI, the Bureau, lacked sufficient evidence to obtain a search warrant for Zorro Ranch. This was, like I said, reported in the weeks after Epstein's death. And obviously someone was asking the question as to why have we not gone to Zorro Ranch? And the FBI was like, well, we don't have enough evidence to get a search warrant. And obviously someone was asking the question as to why Zorro Ranch hadn't been looked at yet or gone through by federal or state authorities. And the FBI was like, well, we don't have enough, evidence to get a search warrant. Now, that statement made by the FBI, allegedly, was the official position and it's also completely false. Once again, allegedly, in my opinion, and also in a world where people have two brain cells to rub together to make a spark, this statement is false. There was plenty of evidence where the FBI, or even in my opinion, state officials, the New Mexico State Police or the county sheriff's office could have gotten a search warrant and gone into Zorro Ranch. So by August of 2019, the FBI was sitting on Maria Farmer's FBI complaint, right? And we'll talk about that really quick in case you're not familiar with it. But Maria Farmer and her younger sister Annie were the first people to formally warn the FBI about Jeffrey Epstein 23 years before he was indicted. In 1996, Maria was a recent graduate of the New York Academy of Art. She was trying to become a professional artist in New York City, which brought her into Jeffrey Epstein's orbit. I think she was at a gallery or something, and then Ghislaine and Epstein came in, and they were like, "We like your work," and they bought a painting from her, whatever, and then made that connection. And this was at the exact same time that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were actively cultivating young female artists, students, and aspiring models, claiming they wanted to help these girls and women improve their lives, kickstart their careers. We've seen this multiple times as we've gone through the Epstein files. Karina Shuliak is one of these examples, but Epstein does this with multiple young women at the same time for years. So Maria Farmer was introduced to Boris and Natasha in 1995. I'm sorry, Boris and Natasha is Epstein and Ghislaine. I didn't want to confuse you, but that's what they remind me of, Boris and Natasha. So she's introduced to them in 1995. They bought one of her paintings, and then they invited her to their home in Manhattan. Epstein then offered Maria work as his personal art advisor and artist in residence, which basically meant she would paint pieces specifically for Epstein. Like she would basically work for him on a commission basis. And at that time, Maria's younger sister, Annie, was 16 years old and attending high school in Arizona. And so Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell flew 16-year-old Annie out to New Mexico to spend some time with them at Zorro Ranch. And allegedly, Ghislaine told Annie that she wanted to mentor her, that she and Epstein were interested in helping Annie with her education and college prospects. And there's a reason why Ghislaine's kind of always at front and center when we talk about Maria and we talk about Annie. She's the front-facing sort of person. It's not just Jeffrey Epstein, this creepy older guy, talking to these young women and being like, I like your painting. Come work for me at my Manhattan townhouse. There's a legitimate woman who seems polished and professional, who seems to have money, who seems to have influence and status. And this woman is saying to these young women, I'm an older woman who cares about your future and your career and you getting into a good college. I've already made it, and now I want to pass that torch. I want to mentor you. So that's what Ghislaine's purpose was for Epstein and in his life. In more ways than one, Ghislaine Maxwell was a gateway for Epstein, and we'll talk about that. But in 2021, Annie Farmer testified under oath during Ghislaine Maxwell's federal trial, and she said that Ghislaine had basically groomed her at Zorro Ranch. It all started kind of innocent. Ghislaine brings her to the ranch. They're having a good time. They're riding horses. Ghislaine brings her shopping for clothes and cowboy boots. And then Ghislaine Maxwell brought Annie to the movies with Jeffrey Epstein. And while they were at the movies, Epstein stroked Annie's hand and caressed her thigh. Later, Annie was pressured into giving Epstein a foot massage. And I guess Ghislaine was also there. And Ghislaine was like, oh, you're not doing this right. I'm going to give you some instruction on how to properly give a massage. And so then Maxwell gave Annie a massage lesson. And during that lesson, she pulled down Annie's shirt and touched her breasts. And then the next morning, Annie said that Jeffrey Epstein crawled into bed with her and pressed his body against hers in an attempt to spoon her. And she jumped out of the bed, but she was trying to act like, oh, nothing's wrong. She said she had to use the bathroom. She kind of went on the rest of that time, which I think was just a few more days she was there, pretending that she was fine, but just trying to avoid Epstein. And then she went home to Arizona, and that was that. She obviously never went back and didn't really talk to anybody about what happened until things started going down with Epstein. Now, weeks later, after this Zorro Ranch incident, something similar happened to Maria Farmer at Les Wexner's New Albany, Ohio mansion. So Epstein had offered Maria the space at Wexner's mansion's guest house so that she could work on her art that she was making for him. And so she was supposed to have been there alone. But then Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell showed up, and she claims that they sexually assaulted her in that guest house. And then Maria was able to escape to a different part of the house. She barricaded herself inside a room using some furniture, but she claims that Les Wexner's security guards told her that she couldn't leave, and she was effectively held against her will for 12 hours until her father drove from a different state to pick her up. So Maria goes back to New York. She called the NYPD's 6th Precinct in Lower Manhattan on August 6, 1996, and they told her that she needed to notify the FBI because the incidents had happened out of state. Now, Maria did call the FBI. Okay, she called the FBI, I believe in New York first. They hung up on her. Then she called the FBI, I believe in New Mexico, and she told them what had happened to her in Ohio. And she told them what had happened to her 16-year-old sister in New Mexico. She also informed the FBI that Jeffrey Epstein had stolen photos and negatives that she'd taken of her 2 younger sisters, aged 12 and 16. And she said she believed Jeffrey Epstein had sold them to potential buyers in his network. Additionally, Maria said that on one occasion, Epstein had asked her to take photos of young girls at swimming pools, and now he was threatening to burn her house down if she told anyone. So the second FBI office that Maria called, they did take a report. They had the report. They did nothing with it. In fact, no one even knew the report existed until the DOJ released a small portion of the Epstein files in December of 2025. And this report, dated September 3rd, 1996, resurfaced. Now, there's a federal lawsuit filed against the FBI by 12 of Jeffrey Epstein's victims, and this lawsuit alleges that the FBI received multiple complaints, reports, and tips concerning Epstein's criminal behavior against girls and women continuously from 1996 to 2006. So what I'm saying is this was plenty of probable cause, which is all that federal agents would need to show a judge to get a search warrant of the Zorro Ranch property, especially after Epstein's 2008 arrest and conviction, especially after his death. But nothing was ever done, not by the FBI. And then something odd happened in New Mexico. In June of 2008, Epstein had pleaded guilty in Florida to 1 count of soliciting prostitution and 1 count of soliciting prostitution from a minor under the age of 18. He served 13 months of an 18-month sentence at the Palm Beach County Stockade, with work release privileges allowing him to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Now, as a convicted sex offender, federal law and most state laws require that Epstein would have to register in any state where he maintained a residence. Epstein registered in both Florida and New York, right? Because he's got his Florida place, he's got his New York place. He has a place in Paris, but that's a different country, so I don't know how that would work. But either way, the places he had in the United States, he was registering as a sex offender. And then in July of 2010, the New Mexico Department of Public Safety sent Epstein a letter notifying him that based on his Florida conviction, he was required to register as a sex offender in New Mexico. So why did it take so long from 2008 to 2010? Because remember, Epstein's in prison for a little over a year. So this is kind of around the time he's being released, and he's about to be back in the general public, and New Mexico's like, hey, you have to register. So on August 17th, 2010, Epstein appeared at the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office to register in person. And the detective who took his registration, her name was Deborah Anea, and she filled out the paperwork, and then she drove out to Zorro Ranch to conduct the routine home visit verification. And this is very customary. It's just to confirm that the offender actually lives at the listed address on the form. So Detective Anaya noted in her report that she saw 2 private jets, 2 helicopters, a fleet of land vehicles, a 33,000 square foot main residence on 7,500 acres, a private airstrip, a helipad, off-grid log cabin, 3-bedroom lodge, a compound that looked nothing like any sex offender residence she had visited. Now, 2 days later, on August 19th, the New Mexico Department of Public Safety sent a follow-up letter to the Santa Fe Sheriff's Office. And this letter said, hey, on reconsideration, Jeffrey Epstein actually doesn't have to register as a sex offender at all. This is 2 days after he's already registered. The letter said, essentially, hey, Epstein pleaded guilty to solicitation of prostitution from a minor, but the language of his plea deal, the sweetheart deal that he got in Florida, that language said the victim was over the age of 16. And in New Mexico, the age of consent is 16. So therefore, what Epstein did wasn't technically a registrable offense in New Mexico. Never mind that investigators in Florida identified at least 36 underage victims during their investigation under the age of 16. Never mind that. Never mind that when the victim that was mentioned in the criminal complaint against Epstein, when the abuse against her started, she was 16. But never mind that. Now, 2 unnamed New Mexico state officials told CBS News that the speed of the reversal, 2 days from registration to deregistration, it was curious. And the then Attorney General Hector Valderra has since said that his office was not involved in the registration decision. That would have been the Department of Public Safety, who reports to the governor's office. Now, in 2010, when this whole registration snafu happened, the governor of New Mexico was Bill Richardson, the same Bill Richardson who was mentioned over 800 times in the Epstein files. So Richardson is kind of like one of those career politicians. I think he's been in politics since the 80s. He served also as the U.S. Secretary of Energy under Bill Clinton from 1998 to 2001. And from 2003 to 2011, he was the governor of New Mexico. And by 2010, he and Epstein were already tight, right? So like towards the end of his governor's reign, he and Epstein, they're besties already. According to the DOJ files, Richardson met with Jeffrey Epstein repeatedly. At least 9 of those meetings happened after Epstein's 2008 Florida conviction, and many took place at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. Epstein also made a $50,000 donation to Bill Richardson's campaign for governor in 2006, and in November of 2010, Bill Richardson was a visitor to Epstein Island. In January of 2011, while he was still governor, flight logs document Bill Richardson as a passenger on Epstein's private plane alongside his then chief of staff, Brian Condit, and Jeffrey Epstein, and 3 other passengers, and at least one of those other 3 passengers has been publicly reported as an alleged Epstein victim. So 5 years after Bill Richardson left office, and 8 years after Epstein's Florida conviction, the 2 men had dinner together in September of 2016. And all the way up until 2018, basically the year before Jeffrey Epstein died in prison, Epstein and Bill Richardson had meetings scheduled with each other. So understand, this is not a one-meeting acquaintance. This really isn't even like, oh, it's some rich guy donating to my campaign, so I have to be nice to him and smile and shake his hand when I see him in public. No, this is a sustained multi-decade relationship that continued long after Jeffrey Epstein was a publicly convicted sex offender. It went on through Epstein's federal indictment. So I'm going to tie all of this together, put a pin in Bill Richardson, because the political back-scratching continues, and I think that we'll find it all ties together. In March of 1993, a lawyer named John J. Kelly signed legal documents for the purchase of the land that Zorro Ranch would be built on, and he signed these legal documents on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, at that time, Kelly was a partner at a prominent Albuquerque law firm, and he'd been appointed as Epstein's attorney-in-fact to close the Zorro Ranch purchase from the King family because Epstein was in New York. So an attorney-in-fact is a person authorized to act on behalf of another person through a power of attorney legal document. So we have John J. Kelly, a lawyer in New Mexico, helping Jeffrey Epstein buy some land in March of 1993. Nothing too major here. He's doing his job, except for the fact that 9 months after signing this paperwork for Epstein, John J. Kelly was made the New Mexico United States Attorney. That role made John Kelly the state's top federal prosecutor, the same position that Alexander Acosta held in Florida when he brokered the horrendous sweetheart deal that was given to Epstein in Florida in 2008. So a state attorney is not just responsible for negotiating deals like Acosta did with Epstein, but they're also responsible for filing charges and deciding if charges should be filed at all, right? They review police reports and the evidence to determine if there's enough to formally charge a suspect with a crime. So 9 months after acting as Jeffrey Epstein's attorney, with his power of attorney, in the sale of Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, John J. Kelly became the person with the power to investigate Jeffrey Epstein in New Mexico, or to not investigate Jeffrey Epstein in New Mexico. Now, Kelly was appointed to this position, the state's attorney, by Bill Clinton. He would hold the state attorney position until the year 2000, and according to a 2024 federal lawsuit filed against the U.S. government by several Epstein victims, numerous complaints about Jeffrey Epstein were made during that time while Kelly was state's attorney, and no investigation was ever launched during Kelly's time as state attorney in New Mexico. It's also worth noting that John J. Kelly appeared in Epstein's little black book, his work number, his home address, and his wife's direct phone number. Now, in a written statement, John Kelly has said he had no knowledge of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes during his time as state attorney, and that his contact with Epstein was limited to signing the real estate paperwork for him in March of 1993. Quote, in 1993, I was asked by the King family, with whom I was well acquainted, if I would assist with a real estate transaction between an out-of-state buyer and the King family with respect to one of the King family properties. That out-of-state buyer turned out to be Jeffrey Epstein, end quote. Now, Kelly said he does not specifically recall any direct interactions with Epstein in connection with that transaction, and he does not specifically recall ever encountering Epstein again after that time. In my opinion, this is a very politician sort of response or statement. He's not saying, I never met that man in person. I know for a fact I never met that man in person. And after I did this real estate deal for him as a lawyer, I never saw him again. He's saying, well, I can't recall if I did. And to follow that, I can't recall if I did. Normally, not recalling would be in a full sentence. I can't recall if I did or if I didn't. So you don't remember. That way, if anything ever comes out, which, I mean, as we've seen with the Epstein files, stuff does, then John Kelly could be like, well, hey, I said I didn't recall, and so I forgot about this other thing you're bringing up and showing me right now. John Kelly currently sits on the Albuquerque Board of Ethics and Campaign Practices. He never publicly disclosed his connection to Jeffrey Epstein until he didn't have a choice because it came out. And following the exposure of his involvement with Epstein, state lawmakers formed a bipartisan truth commission to investigate Epstein's operations in New Mexico. And it's not just Epstein's connections to John Kelly, it's Epstein's connections to a lot of powerful people in New Mexico. But essentially, this truth commission would launch an investigation that would include looking into why earlier federal investigations had been started and then stopped, and why earlier, state investigations in New Mexico had been started and stopped. And we're going to talk about that. But first, let's talk about the King family. In my opinion, when you look at the King family, and listen, I don't live in New Mexico, I don't know these people, I only know what I've, researched and read about them. But when you look at the King family, this is the Dutton family from Yellowstone, right? It's the family that you see in any kind of crime meets country sort of television show or movie where they got one guy in law enforcement, they got one guy in politics, they got one guy in the financial aspect, they got somebody in every area of power and control, anything to benefit the family and their needs and what will be best for them in the end. So in my opinion, I'm getting that kind of vibe. But the King family, they've been in New Mexico for a long time. They came there in 1918 when Molly and William King left Texas and then homesteaded 160 acres in Stanley, the very same place where Jeffrey Epstein's Zorro Ranch exists. Over the following century, the King family built one of the largest corn and alfalfa operations in Santa Fe County, and then alongside the farm, a multi-generational political machine. And this political machine was headed by the patriarch, Bruce King. Rancher turned Democratic politician, Bruce King would become the longest-serving governor in New Mexico state history. He served 3 non-consecutive terms from 1971 to 1975, from 1980 to 1983, and finally from 1991 to 1995. Now, during his third term, Bruce King and his family sold the sprawling parcel of land in Stanley to Jeffrey Epstein. Bruce King's son, Gary King, holds a PhD in organic chemistry as well as a law degree, and he served in the New Mexico House of Representatives from 1987 to 1998. Now, this was a seat that had previously belonged to his father, Bruce, who had served 5 consecutive terms in the House of Representatives, and he acted as Speaker of the House for 3 of those. So I say this to show you that Bruce King, the patriarch, the guy who started it all for the King family, as far as this Dutton family ranch example I'm using, he held very important political power. Actually, the Duttons have nothing on the King family at this point. The Speaker is also second in line to become president, immediately following the vice president. So while Gary King was never Speaker of the House like his father, he did sit on the House of Representatives in his father's seat, and he was New Mexico's Attorney General from 2007 to 2015. And this was a position that he got into after aggressively campaigning on how he was going to prosecute the hell out of child sex offenders. That was a big platform in his campaign. Now, in 2014, Gary King actually ran for governor, wanting to follow in his daddy's footsteps. And although he didn't win that race, he did accept campaign donations from Jeffrey Epstein, which is funny because in 2014, Gary King claimed that Epstein had donated to his attorney general campaign back in 2006, but he was like, I gave that money back after Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in 2008. I gave it back to him. I would absolutely not accept that money from that kind of person. And I guess it was easy to make those claims in 2014 when you're kind of running for governor and you want to make sure that, nobody's going to call you a hypocrite. And also over a decade before the DOJ dropped the Epstein files, which, now we know it's pretty difficult to make claims. I think anybody associated with Epstein at this point is either not saying anything or making careful statements like, I don't recall, or I can't remember. But no, Gary King said it with his chest. He was like, I gave that money back. I didn't even know who it came from. How am I supposed to know where every donation comes from? But let's zoom out, though, and look at the actual timeline and the supported facts of Gary King and Jeffrey Epstein. So in 2006, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in Florida for the first time. His arrest made national news. Throughout 2006 and 2007, Epstein contributed $15,000 to Gary King's campaign for New Mexico Attorney General, an election that we know Gary King won before being sworn in as AG in January of 2007. In 2014, when he was running for governor, Gary King swore up and down that he had returned that money to Epstein after his arrest. And he also said that he didn't think he had ever met Epstein personally and that Epstein knew other members of his family better. It should come as no surprise to anyone. That was not the whole truth or anything even close to it. In fact, I'd probably say Gary King, from what I've discovered, knew Jeffrey Epstein the most and was closest to him out of anybody in the King family. So in 2010, while Gary King was the New Mexico Attorney General, and when Epstein had been a registered sex offender for 2 years, a staff member in the New Mexico Attorney General's office reached out to Epstein and his assistant using an official government email to arrange a meeting between Gary King and Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Gary King would later, recently, decades after this, he came out and he was like, oh, that's because my dad died, his dad, Bruce King. And Epstein, he wanted to give his condolences because he liked my dad or whatever. And so he wanted to meet for lunch. So I met him for lunch at this restaurant in New Mexico. And then, that was it. He's still a bad guy. You know what I mean? Why, even if you took that and you didn't know anything else I'm about to tell you, but even if you took that and you were like, well, yeah, Gary just met with a guy who wanted to give his condolences. You still knew he was a bad guy to the point where, according to you, years before you met with Jeffrey Epstein for lunch, you gave him back his campaign donation because he was a bad guy. And of what you campaigned on, the whole down with child sex offender thing. So why would you have to meet him for lunch? Why can't you just be like, thanks for your condolences over email and move on with your day? So then in 2014, Gary King, who's the attorney general, he runs for governor of New Mexico against Republican incumbent Susana Martinez. And his running mate at that time was Deb Haaland, the same Deb Haaland who would later become Joe Biden's interior secretary. Now, according to the DOJ files, where there's emails and stuff, in June of 2014, Gary King personally emailed Jeffrey Epstein and thanked him for a proposed $50,000 personal contribution to the campaign, the governor campaign. Remember, Epstein's already donated to Gary King's AG campaign years back, and then Gary King gave the money back to him. But then Epstein's lawyer, Darren Indyke, he was like, hey, we could have a problem. I was looking at Gary King's campaign website for the contribution, and it says that King is committed to protecting the children of New Mexico against predators, and he is dedicated to getting these criminals off the streets and putting them in prison. And Darren Indyke was like, well, this might be an issue for us because you, Jeffrey Epstein, might risk additional news coverage if King accepted that money, given what he runs his platform on. And, it's the political machine and everybody's trying to call everybody out and they're trying to find dirt on their opponents. Somebody's going to find this. Somebody's going to point it out. And, it's not going to look good for anybody. And Epstein said, quote, good catch. Let's use companies or trusts, end quote. By the way, there's also conversations between Epstein and his lawyer, Darren Indyke, where Darren's like, yeah, it looks like the woman running against Gary King, like she has a much better shot of winning. And you were right. We probably backed the wrong horse here. So I want you to understand, it's not necessarily that Jeffrey Epstein cares about the King family. It's not necessarily that Jeffrey Epstein has such a close relationship with them and he's just very loyal to them and he wants the King family to succeed at all costs. He knows how deeply embedded the King family is in New Mexico. He has Zorro Ranch in New Mexico and he wants to do whatever the hell he wants in New Mexico. He wants to make sure that he is supporting and has the loyalty of whoever is in power. So initially, he was probably like, oh, Gary King is a shoo-in for this, right? He was on the House of Representatives. He was the AG. His father was the longest running governor in all of New Mexico state history. The King family is, a dynasty here. He's a shoo-in. This is the one who's going to be in power, the one that I'm going to have to make sure I have in my pocket. But that didn't end up happening. But regardless, after Darren Indyke pointed out this kind of issue with Jeffrey Epstein donating to Gary King's campaign with his own name, the donation started going to Gary King's campaign for governor from Epstein's shell companies, with approximately $35,000 donated across multiple Epstein-linked entities. So also, this pisses me off the most, I think, more than even the campaign money, because of how Gary King was like, I barely know that dude. And there was other members of my family that were way closer to him. And I just, as soon as I figured out what he was doing, I gave all of the money back. The fact that Gary King said all of this with his chest, and then now we know he did what I'm going to tell you he did, it pisses me off. So on September 8th, 2014, Gary King, Deb Haaland, and two of their campaign staffers flew to Washington, D.C. on a private jet arranged by Jeffrey Epstein to attend multi-day fundraising events. And then on September 9th, literally the very next day after he's flying on Epstein's plane that was arranged for him by Epstein, Gary King said he didn't know that the over $35,000 in campaign donations had come from Epstein, and he and Deb Haaland were going to give it all back. He actually said, quote, my campaign has an ongoing rule that I would not accept any contributions directly from Mr. Epstein, and upon further review, we have learned that he had an interest in these companies in question. Unfortunately, my fundraising staff missed this in the vetting process, end quote. Yeah, no. And this only came after the Santa Fe New Mexican was looking into the contributions, right? So it's not like Gary King just came out and he was like, by the way, I just found out that my campaign accepted $35,000 from Jeffrey Epstein and entities connected to him. And I am outraged by this. I'm more outraged than you guys are. No, he got called out on it. People were looking into it, as they do when somebody's running for an important position like governor of a state. And they were like, hey, your campaign contributions aren't coming from a good source. And we already had to talk about this when you ran for AG, how you took money from Epstein. So what the hell's going on? Why are you doing it again? Okay. Because the worst part is, like, some of the campaign donations that came for his governor race, they were linked to entities that had also donated for the AG race. I think it was like the Zorro Ranch entity, basically. And how did you not see that? Like, how did you not know, that they were the same? And you already allegedly gave the money back from your AG race campaign contribution. But no, okay, just absolutely ridiculous, Gary King. So these people looking into it, they identified several contributions to the campaign that came from companies in the U.S. Virgin Islands that all had the same address. And that address was also on the New York State Sex Offender Registry. And that address also belonged to a Jeffrey Epstein. It was the same address that Jeffrey Epstein had used when registering Zorro Development Corporation in New Mexico, which is the same entity that donated to Gary King's AG campaign. And this dude, Gary King, he said he had no idea the money had come from Epstein. It was a huge mistake, and he blamed his poor fundraising staff literally a day after happily riding on a private jet arranged by Jeffrey Epstein. And also, I just want to point out, subsequent New Mexico campaign finance reports shows no evidence that Gary King ever actually gave the money back to Epstein. Not in 2006, not in 2014. And then after the DOJ files dropped and we could see everything, including that chartered jet flight the day before Gary King acted all high and mighty about his donations from Epstein. So he had another response now, which was essentially the same excuse he'd given about the campaign donations. We didn't know the plane had anything to do with Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, Target 7 revealed to you yesterday how gubernatorial candidate Deb Haaland and former Attorney General Gary King were found in the Epstein files.
Documents showed they took a chartered flight organized by Jeffrey Epstein to Washington, D.C. over a decade ago. Haaland told us she had no clue who organized it. Well, today we're hearing from King.
Couldn't find any red-eye flights, and it was an important meeting at that time with these union leaders in Washington, D.C.
Gary King explained to Target 7 how he and then candidate for Lieutenant Governor Deb Haaland ended up on a flight manifest linked to Jeffrey Epstein in 2014. Tuesday, we showed you these 3 documents, downloaded directly from the U.S. Department of Justice's website. They show that King, along with Haaland, took a chartered flight from Santa Fe to Washington, D.C. The flight manifest lists a client as an LLC owned by Jeffrey Epstein. An email say King asked Epstein directly to use his plane for the flight. Despite those emails, King told us today that former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson is actually the one that arranged it for him, as he needed to make it to D.C. for a meeting he was attending for his gubernatorial run.
It was an important meeting at that time with these union leaders in Washington, D.C. It was, I think, the National Education Association and one of the big government employees unions and the firefighters and several that Bill Richardson knew well. And so he was trying to help us to get that set up. And so we just decided the best way to get there was to charter an airplane, a private jet.
He also says he only met Epstein in person one time.
The time that I met him, he called me because he'd heard that my dad had passed away. And he said that he wanted to meet with me and have coffee and express his condolences for the loss of my dad. And so we met in Santa Fe and had a cup of tea, actually.
Now, King once again reiterated he had no idea that the charter company or the plane were associated with Epstein. He also told us he returned any campaign contributions that Epstein or his associated companies donated to him during his multiple runs for office. For Target 7, I'm Jason McNabb.
All right, Jason, thank you. And as for Richardson, who died in 2023, his attorneys and spokespeople have maintained that he was not friends with Epstein. They said Richardson and his wife had only been to the ranch once.
So Gary King is throwing Bill Richardson under the bus, even though there is an email where King is asking Epstein for help getting a plane. There's an email, Gary King, okay? Just the audacity of these people. It really does piss me off because they think we're dumb. They think we'll take anything they say to us, lies and contradictions, thrown out when the proof is in black and white. We have an email, Gary King, that says you were looking for a jet and you asked Epstein for help. They think we're just going to take it all and we'll smile and believe everything they say. And we'll be like, well, they're smarter and better than us, so I guess we're just wrong and we can't read or see what's in front of us with our own eyes. Like, ugh, just absolutely the audacity. And like I said, We already talked about Bill Richardson. He's not, getting out of this unscathed, even though by the time Gary King tried to blame him for the plane, Richardson had already passed away, so he couldn't defend himself, and that's pretty convenient for Gary King and pretty shitty on Gary King's part, but hey, they all know each other. Gary King was probably like, Bill Richardson would approve of this political shifting tactic. I think he's smiling at me from beyond the grave. Then we have Rhonda King. That's Gary's cousin. She inherited Gary's House seat, the House of Representatives seat that he held, and then his father, Bruce, held before him. She got it in 1999. She held it for 14 years until 2012. As of now, there's no documented evidence that Rhonda communicated with or took money from Jeffrey Epstein. So it looks like the female members of the King family might be a little bit more intelligent than their male counterparts. But Rhonda's cousin, Jerry King, is another story. Jerry King is Bruce King's nephew, making him also Gary King's cousin. And basically, Jerry is part of that third generation of the King family operating inside New Mexico state government in the same time period and geographic area as Zorro Ranch. And Jerry had a career path that placed him at the precise institutional pressure point that Jeffrey Epstein needed at that time and in that place. So in 2003, Jerry King became the Assistant State Land Commissioner at the New Mexico State Land Office. This is the very same office that administers roughly 9 million acres of trust land, including the roughly 1,200 acres of trust land surrounding Zorro Ranch that Epstein basically picked up from the King family and then leased for $872 a year, which seems low for all that space, but okay. All right, so to understand this, we need to get some quick foundational knowledge. When New Mexico became a state in 1912, the federal government granted it roughly 9 million acres of land in trust. Okay, that meant that this land was very specifically meant to be used for the benefit of the public schools, hospitals, other state institutions. That land is administered and basically controlled and run by the New Mexico State Land Office, headed by the State Land Commissioner. Now, the State Land Office doesn't sell those 9 million acres. It leases them, mostly to ranchers for grazing, to oil and gas companies for extraction, and to agricultural users, like people planting, things like that. The revenue is then funneled back to the schools and other state beneficiaries. So the revenue they make from leasing this land is supposed to go back towards the people of New Mexico. They could have been charging Jeffrey Epstein a hell of a lot more all year for leasing that much land, but they didn't. And, I'm not really familiar with all of this state land and stuff, but if you live in New Mexico and you know, is that a typical price, or did Epstein get a deal? Or did the King family get a deal, and then Epstein, when he got their lease of that same land, that deal just kind of transferred over to him? Did anybody get a deal here? Because that seems really low for that much land. Now, this is basically what the Land Commissioner's Office does, right? And it has its own enforcement staff, its own inspectors, and also the legal authority to terminate any lease when the person who's leasing the land isn't using the land for the stated purpose. So when Epstein bought the land where he would build Zorro Ranch in 1993, it included the state grazing leases that the Kings had been operating on the adjacent state trust parcels. And the stated purpose under that lease was livestock grazing. That's really the only legal basis on which state trust land can be leased like this. It has to be used for an agricultural or productive purpose for the benefit of the state. And the job of Assistant State Land Commissioner, who was Jerry King, is very operationally significant, right? Like the main land commissioner guy, he's more like a figurehead. He's shaking hands, he's doing all that. But the assistant, his assistant or her assistant, they're the ones doing all the senior administrative work that moves paperwork, schedules inspections, schedules meetings, decides processing priorities on state land lease matters, all the stuff that really matters. So like I said, the commissioner is the elected face. The assistant commissioners are the people who actually run the day-to-day. Jerry King was in that role in 2003. And from at least 2004, the State Land Office's official correspondence lists Jerry King as one of the 2 designated point people for Jeffrey Epstein and his staff at Zorro Ranch. Okay, so in August of 2007, Zorro Ranch managers had a conference call with Jerry King, and they wanted to make sure their lease paperwork was correct, allegedly. At least that's what the notes said about the call. Now, in February of 2008, the same year Epstein pleaded guilty in Florida, 2 years after he's arrested, Epstein's people scheduled a private meeting with Jerry King to deal with state delays on processing a business lease. Once again, if that is what they talked about, if that's what their subject of their meeting was, I don't know. But I want to be very careful when I tell you the files, the ones we have at least, because remember, only half of the files have been released, but the files we have released, they don't allege that Jerry King did anything bad or wrong or beyond his job. The state land office, though, looking back now, says that this arrangement with King being the point person at Zorro Ranch, it should have been treated as a conflict of interest. But I repeat, we have no clear-cut evidence that Jerry King did anything wrong. But let's break this down. Jeffrey Epstein owned 7,500 acres. That was his private property. But surrounding his property on 3 sides was another 1,244 acres of state-owned land, public land that belongs to the people of New Mexico. And he didn't own that. He rented it from the state for $872 a year, which is crazy cheap if you think about it. But here's the catch. The only legal reason the state could lease that land was for cattle grazing. The whole point of those leases is to generate revenue for New Mexico's public schools by letting ranchers run cattle on what would otherwise be empty land. So really, all Jeffrey Epstein had to do was put a bunch of cows out there and let them eat some grass and do their cow thing. Now, the state of New Mexico had one job that they had to do every few years for this. They had to go out and figure out if Epstein was actually putting cows on that leased land, or if he was using that land for something else, which would revoke the lease and take that land from him. And when I say something else, I just mean basically there's no cows on the land. Okay, that's basically all he would have to be doing, because I and a lot of other people don't think he was using that land for anything. He was just using it as a buffer so that nobody could get close to his compound. Why? Why did he not want anybody to get close or to, be able to access it easily? That's the question that's very important, because you can say people want privacy. Yeah, sure. But you already have a ton of land, 7,500 acres. So you can already put your compound in the middle of that and you'd be pretty far out from everyone else. This, additional acreage was just extra room, a moat around the land he owned. So basically, like I said, New Mexico State, they got to send out an inspector, and the inspector drives to the land. They walk the property, they count the cows, they check the fences, they make sure things are being used for the purposes stated in the lease. That's the whole job. Now, if the inspector finds an issue, say there's no cows, or there's fences that block public access where there shouldn't be any, or signs the land is being used as a buffer for a private compound, the inspector writes it up. That report goes to the senior officials at the state land office. Their job is to then act on it. So they can either send a more senior inspector, they can kind of force the issue, they can demand that the person leasing the land fix the problem, they can even just cancel the lease, right, without any further action. That's how the system is supposed to work. Now, for 16 years, every time the New Mexico state inspector tried to go and do their job at Epstein's land, they got turned away. The gate was locked, the staff blocked him, he couldn't walk the land, he couldn't count the cows, he couldn't do his inspection. And I guess whenever the state inspector would be able to sort of be sneaky and get kind of close to the land or walk around it, they said they would see sometimes no cows, almost no cows on the land at all. So when the King family used to own it, they ran about 300 head of cattle. And under Epstein, the count was as low as 40. And it kind of seems like he just took whatever cows the King family already had and then, kind of just didn't add any more or really, really take care of them. I don't want to say that, but yeah, it didn't seem like he cared. The cows were just decoration, like the petroglyphs. So ultimately, the state decided, hey, this land being leased by Jeffrey Epstein is not being used for grazing. It's being used essentially as a privacy moat around his huge compound. The state inspectors knew this. They wrote it down. For 16 years, the reports said the same thing. We can't access the land. The use doesn't match the lease. This isn't right. But the state can't do anything about it. It's the state land office that has the power to terminate the lease or to, do something to the person leasing the land. So the state land office, where Jerry King was the assistant commissioner, they were the ones who could have done something, but they did nothing. Jerry King, the guy whose desk the inspector reports land on, the nephew of Bruce King, who was the governor who sold Epstein the land, the cousin of Gary King, the state attorney general who took Epstein's money, and then Jerry himself was the official point of contact for Jeffrey Epstein's staff on lease matters for the land, the state land. So this means when Epstein and his people in New Mexico had a problem with the state, they called Jerry King. And when the state's own inspectors filed reports saying they couldn't get on the land, those reports went up the chain to Jerry King. The state's inspection system only works if somebody at the top is willing to enforce it when inspectors get blocked. The whole point of having senior officials is that when a frontline inspector says, I couldn't do my job, somebody senior says, okay, then we cancel the lease or we send the sheriff or we make this person comply. For 16 years, that somebody senior was Jerry King. He was the point at Zorro Ranch. That's who the inspectors would have gone to. Plus, he was the assistant commissioner, and Jerry King was structurally compromised, in my opinion. He was a member of the family that had sold the land to Epstein. He was a member of the family that had taken money from Epstein, right? Because, we've got people, Gary King. I know it's Gary and Jerry. It's confusing. Gary was the one who ran for governor. Jerry's the assistant state land commissioner. You got Gary over here taking money for his political campaigns. And, you don't have to prove Jerry King personally killed any specific inspection report. It's a fact that nobody's produced an email of him telling an inspector to back off. There may not even be an email like that, although there's still, 4 million files we haven't seen. But there may not be an email like that. It may have been more subtle or in person. But what I will say is when Stephanie Garcia Richard took over as state land commissioner in 2019, she canceled the entire Zorro Ranch lease in 3 months. It took her 3 months after taking office, the same position that Jerry King held. She cited the same access obstruction the previous administration had been ignoring for 16 years. The evidence had been there the whole time. It's not like Jerry King could have been like, well, it never came across my desk, or I didn't see it, or I didn't know. No, I guarantee you those inspectors were blowing up Jerry's phone, and he was ignoring them. The inspectors' reports had been on file the whole time. The misrepresentations about cattle counts had been there the whole time. What changed wasn't the evidence. What changed was who was sitting in the chair to see the evidence. And while we're still on the topic of the King family for a few more minutes, you should understand that during the time 3 generations of Kings were running for office, sitting in the governor's mansion, running the AG's office, on the side, they were also the biggest recipient of federal farm money in their own county through the federal farm subsidy program. Once again, I'm not a country girl, so I have to look all this stuff up. The federal farm subsidy program, the original idea for that program was born during the Great Depression, and it really was just intended to keep small farmers afloat during bad harvests. However, it has now become U.S. taxpayer dollars going to landowners. And in practice, it seems like most of the money, the taxpayer money, ends up with whoever owns the most land, which in this county specifically would be the King family. So between 1995 and 2009, the King family's 4 Santa Fe County properties received over $2,100,000 in federal farm subsidies. That figure represented 57% of every federal farm subsidy dollar flowing into Santa Fe County during that period. Over half going to one family. The single largest beneficiary among the family members was Don L. King. I think he uses the middle initial so you don't confuse him for Don King. But Don L. King received over $365,000 personally. The second largest beneficiary was Bruce King, the former 3-term governor of New Mexico himself, who pocketed over $122,000 in federal subsidies during and after his time in office. During his time in office. The current Attorney General of New Mexico at the time, Gary King, was a 16.67% owner of one of the subsidized properties throughout his tenure. The Assistant State Land Commissioner, Jerry King, Gary's cousin, Gary and Jerry, I bet they were fun at Christmas. He was a 16.67% owner of the same property throughout his tenure. as the Assistant State Land Commissioner. This is documented in the federal government's own records, available on the Environmental Working Group's Public Farm Subsidy Database. None of this is contested. None of this is hidden. It's like everything else in this story, kind of. It's just hiding in plain sight in places that nobody bothered to look. Well, by now, some people have bothered to look. We're going to shout one of them out later, but yeah, it's pretty bad. Because the King family didn't just hold political power and pull. They were on the receiving end of a good chunk of public money at the same time. So let's call all our shady friends back to the table for a snack and a recap. In 2003, Bill Richardson becomes governor of New Mexico. The same year, Jerry King takes the Assistant State Land Commissioner's job. Throughout Bill Richardson's entire 2 terms, state inspectors documented that they couldn't access Zorro Ranch's leased state land. Now, Jerry King is the point person for Zorro Ranch at the state land office. July of 2010, during Bill Richardson's term as governor, Epstein is told by the New Mexico Department of Safety that he has to register as a sex offender, but the next month he does register with the sheriff's office. But 2 days later, the New Mexico Department of Public Safety, who would report to Bill Richardson, they say, no, we changed our mind. You don't have to. What you did wasn't illegal here. This is, of course, a few years after Epstein made a generous donation to Richardson's campaign for governor, and just a few months before Richardson flies to Little St. James Island. Now, in her 2016 deposition, Virginia Giuffre testified that Ghislaine Maxwell directed her to give Bill Richardson a massage. She said she had been sent to New Mexico for this explicit purpose. She said she couldn't remember the exact date or specific location, but she named Bill Richardson along with other prominent figures, including former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. Now, Bill Richardson responded to this through his attorney and in a Bloomberg interview, and he said he had never met Virginia, that all the allegations against him were untrue, and that he was neither a target, subject, nor witness in any federal investigation. And he maintained this position publicly until his death. And outside of Virginia's claims, there is technically yet no corroborating evidence tying Bill Richardson to any crimes or abuse yet. Although he did take money from Jeffrey Epstein, and then that same Jeffrey Epstein he allowed to live in New Mexico without being a registered sex offender, even though Epstein had to register as a sex offender in every other state he lived in. So, while Jeffrey Epstein's living in New Mexico, I guess you could say that if Bill Richardson was responsible for that decision or had anything to do with, 2 days after you register, we're going to tell you don't have to register. If he had anything to do with that, that would be, I think, definitely an issue, and maybe you're not so worried about protecting the women and young girls in your state that you're governor of. But that's, I guess, all I can say about Bill Richardson when it comes to that. So in November of 2018, Miami Herald investigative reporter Julie K. Brown published a multi-part series called Perversion of Justice. This is a very well-known series. It was really the first time in over a decade where everything was laid out, right? Epstein's full scope Florida case, 80 known victims being identified, and also Julie Brown talked about and wrote about the secret federal non-prosecution agreement, the sweetheart deal that Florida had given Epstein. And also Julie Brown wrote that, hey, these victims, these survivors, the women and girls who were a part of bringing Epstein even to a place where he'd get arrested and go to court, they were not notified about the deal, about him getting a deal. They were not notified that a deal was happening. They were not notified at how shitty the deal was. Well, it wasn't shitty for Epstein. It was great for him. How shitty for everybody else it was. They were not notified about the many, many people who were gifted immunity with this deal. So what this series did, though, was it kind of really pushed everything to the forefront. It made the names of Epstein and a lot of his political connections and his properties, his physical properties around the world, it made that public in a way we had never seen before. So Julie Brown's amazing reporting, it kind of made state attorney generals across the county look at their own local jurisdictions and be like, hey, has Epstein ever lived here, right? Or has he ever visited here? Did he ever own property here? And if the answer to that was yes, like with New Mexico, the people in New Mexico were now looking at their jurisdiction and their state and being like, hey, if Epstein did this in Florida, did he do it here? do we now have to investigate if something potentially happened here? And in New Mexico, the person who asked that question was Hector Baldera. He was the state attorney general, and his office formally opened an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein sometime in late 2018 and then early 2019. And the New Mexico investigation focused specifically on Zorro Ranch and Epstein's New Mexico operations. So the question was, hey, had minors been trafficked and abused there at Zorro Ranch? Was Epstein's state land lease arrangement on the up and up? And also, were there any state-level co-conspirators, meaning were there any people in government or positions of power here in New Mexico who had enabled or assisted Epstein in any way? I think the answer to that is yes, but that's hindsight. So by mid-2019, the New Mexico investigation had produced, in its own subsequent words, on the record, affirmative documentary and witness evidence of a working trafficking enterprise, okay? So that's what basically Hector Baldera and the AG's office said. Yeah, we found evidence of this trafficking operation, this enterprise. We found evidence that shit was going down. They had statements from at least 2 named victims describing abuse at Zorro Ranch. They had on-the-record interviews with women who agreed to be witnesses. They had recorded witness interviews. They had police reports. They had a lot. In Baldera's own words, quote, we had taken statements involving child sex trafficking, and we had obtained corroborating records that confirmed an illicit enterprise, end quote. Then Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on July 6th, 2019, and 2 days later, his indictment was unsealed in the Southern District of New York. Now, within days, the Southern District of New York contacted Baldera's office in New Mexico, and they had a specific request. They said, stand down on your state investigation so that the federal investigation that we're doing here in New York will not be confusing. So we can have like a unified federal case. Basically, stop your state investigation, stop your local investigation, give us everything you have, and then we'll have a unified federal case, and we'll read you in on it, and we'll tell you anything we find out about what's going on in your state, and it'll be great. We're going to get this guy.
Just about in the big first phase of our investigation, we were contacted by the DOJ in New York. We had confirmed, and they had confirmed with us, that we were potentially interviewing the same victims, and they were concerned that if we had differing statements among victims, that the case could be compromised.
Baldera said the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York asked the state of New Mexico to halt its investigation.
Or they asked us to pause and stand down.
So Baldera's office handed over all the evidence they had gathered to the DOJ. Chief Deputy Attorney General at the time, Clara Moran, who is now a district court judge, wrote this email to the DOJ. The AG's office was wanting the feds to share evidence. It was over a month after Epstein's jail cell suicide. She said, quote, Epstein's death should not be the end of this criminal inquiry. In another letter sent almost a year later, Moran asked the DOJ to seize all of Epstein's New Mexico properties, including Zorro Ranch. That never happened, nor did the DOJ ever get back to the AG for his request to share evidence. Baldera says that hampered his ability to secure indictments for crimes committed in New Mexico.
It would have been much easier to take that property the way they take property from a tax evader. It's still strange and worthy of criticism that they should have probably seized that ranch in 2019.
Just flat out, was the property ever searched?
We were never informed by the federal authorities that they executed a search warrant.
Balderas adds, under him, state investigators never searched the property.
Well, this case is a horrific black eye in New Mexico.
Now, the person who was the face of this request was Maureen Comey, the then assistant U.S. attorney with the Southern District of New York and daughter of former FBI Director James Comey. So New Mexico handed over all of its evidence, sent it off to New York. They never got anything back. And listen, understand, by the time they sent it off, this was for a federal case, the Southern District of New York federal case, that lasted 34 days and ended with Jeffrey Epstein's alleged death on August 10th, 2019. But get this, New Mexico gave all their evidence to the feds on September 17th, 5 weeks after the federal criminal case was also dead, right? Because the case just dropped. The person you're going after is dead. He's not here, allegedly. Don't come for me. So the federal case ended, and then they still wanted the evidence that New Mexico had against Jeffrey Epstein. Why? Why did Maureen Comey want that evidence that New Mexico had against Jeffrey Epstein, who had Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, right? So it's not like it's just some random state investigating Jeffrey Epstein. No, it's a state that has a legitimate reason to, who had already identified victims. Why did the FBI want all of that stuff 5 weeks after Jeffrey Epstein died and their case was done? Well, maybe they wanted it, so that they could go after like his associates or like people who had helped him or aided and abetted him. But they haven't done that either, right? Have they? We've kind of come to that conclusion. The only person besides Jeffrey Epstein who ever got in trouble for this is Ghislaine Maxwell. And there's plenty of other people, men, who should be in trouble for this, but they're not. So they've never gone after anybody else. The feds have really never gone after anybody else for this, and they've said by this point they're not going to. So why did, 5 weeks after Epstein died, why did the FBI and the Southern District of New York still want all the evidence that New Mexico had against Jeffrey Epstein? And if they wanted information about Epstein, information about Ghislaine Maxwell and like Epstein's associates, if they wanted that stuff, you'd think that they would go to Zorro Ranch at some point, like after Epstein was arrested in 2019, after he died in 2019. But no federal raid was ever conducted at Zorro Ranch. I mean, that we know of, not an official one on the books, right? And then there was also something that we found out during the Transparency Act that released the Epstein files. We found out that 3 months after New Mexico handed over all their evidence against Jeffrey Epstein to the FBI, an anonymous email arrived at the FBI claiming that there were bodies buried near Zorro Ranch property. And did the FBI share that information with New Mexico? No, they didn't. Balderas, the sitting attorney general of the state where those bodies were allegedly buried, was not told. He didn't learn about the email until 2025 when Congress forced the release of the file. The federal prosecutor who shut down the state investigation, Maureen Comey, was herself fired by the Department of Justice in July 2025 with no explanation given. She was the last person in federal law enforcement with firsthand institutional knowledge of why New Mexico had been told to stop. And there's a thread to this Maureen Comey, FBI. Why didn't the FBI look at Zorro Ranch? Why did they stop New Mexico from going after Epstein and doing anything at Zorro Ranch? Why did they take all of New Mexico's evidence after the case was already dead? There is a thread to pull here, but we just don't have time for that right now. Because something about all of this coming together doesn't look good or feel good. If I'm being honestly, we have all of these political powerhouse figures, most of them from the same family, making Zorro Ranch and Jeffrey Epstein's presence in New Mexico possible and as discreet as possible. And the question is why? Why did Jeffrey Epstein want to be in New Mexico? Well, let's hear it from the horse's mouth in this interview between Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein from 2019.
So why did I buy a ranch in New Mexico in 1993? So that gives you some sense. So I would have funded it in 1990. Los Alamos, which was the high-energy lab up in New Mexico, was losing all its scientists.
And Los Alamos, it was where Oppenheimer and where a lot of the nuclear weapons program, the bomb.
That's where the Manhattan Project.
Manhattan Project was Los Alamos, and you bought your property out in New Mexico to be near that?
Yes, because the scientists were going to be, they cut the funding for high-energy physics. But the people who worked in Los Alamos would still be in the Santa Fe area.
They cut that because this was the Cold War dividend, right?
I don't remember exactly why. It was because, again, people thought that physics and high-energy physics really wasn't that important.
Because that was about nuclear weapons.
No, it was because they decided, which may be not right. This was the same time that Murray Gell-Mann came up with the term quark, Q-U-A-R-K. He picked it out of an old poem, the word quark. But it was mysterious. So they were starting to understand in the 90s that our world of the physics world, there was things that were just unexplainable. They called it strange things. You gave it a name. You gave it some characteristics. You called it had charm, was one of the terms. It had a charm. It had a flavor. It had a color. But no one, Mr. Bannon, understood what it was. Just like the financial system.
And you wanted to investigate that?
I wanted to see if we could build tools so others smarter than me could help investigate it.
And that was the beginning of your concept of the Santa Fe Institute?
Yes.
And Santa Fe Institute was founded to do study in this type of.
Can these areas of strange things be described by some form of mathematics?
So that's what I'm trying to get at. The foundational thought, the organizing principle of Santa Fe,
yes,
in the high physics lab at Los Alamos,
right,
which had been the headquarters of Manhattan, and the Trinity Project, right, the bomb.
Yes.
So you're talking about the elite, the high priest
of physics.
Of physics.
Yes, sir.
Which high priest of physics, some subset of that is also mathematics.
Yes, they're both similar. 300 years ago, they said that unexplainable realm was God. And the people who attempted, in fact, to explain the unexplainable, who said, yes, I understand the unexplainable, were charlatans. They were the occults. They were the astrologers. They were the con men.
Okay, so you should actually watch that whole interview if you ever have time. It's simply funny because every time Steve Bannon talks, Jeffrey Epstein looks like he wants to just like lose it. He just looks like, I think it's whenever anyone else talks who Jeffrey Epstein doesn't think is as smart as him, he just looks very like, get me out of here, I can't take this. But as much as Epstein wanted people to think he was very like charismatic and could manipulate people, which I'm sure he could, but there are certain times where he wears his feelings all over his face. But all right, what did Jeffrey Epstein say there? He said he wanted to be in New Mexico because of the scientists at the Santa Fe Institute. Now, here's where things are going to get twisty and turny. It feels like when you shake a magic 8-ball and that white message floats to the top, we're going to see some previously untethered concepts that we've been toying with start to float to the top, and it's kind of disturbing. So let me give just a quick definition of what the Santa Fe Institute is, and I'm going to go deeper into that afterwards. So it's basically an institute that was created in New Mexico, but a lot of the scientists who went to work there came from Los Alamos National Lab, and I believe also Sandia as well, this Sandia Lab. So when public funding or when government funding kind of ceased after the Cold War, and it wasn't going to the national labs as much, some of those scientists were getting laid off, or they weren't being able to kind of do the projects that they wanted to do. They weren't able to do the work they do. So they said, let's do a private lab that will be funded by private people, not the government, so that we can do this work that we're interested in doing. Now, that's very important because this is going to be a private lab, not a publicly funded lab. So basically, the main goal of the Santa Fe Institute is to get as many high donors in as possible. It's a business. And this is what Epstein said brought him to New Mexico, the Santa Fe Institute, and what they were studying and what they were trying to figure out. And it was very interesting to him. And we've talked about Epstein and how he talks to all these scientists and how he wants to know everything. And, you know, he's trying to figure out how to live forever and put his consciousness into somebody else's body or into some AI thing. There's a lot going on there. We will talk about it. We'll talk about exactly what the Santa Fe Institute was focused on and why that interested Epstein. Now, I do have to give a shout out here to Elisa Valdez Rodriguez, whose name many of you gave to me when I mentioned I was looking into Zorro Ranch, New Mexico, and Epstein. Her reporting on all of this has been illuminating, invaluable. It has connected so many dots for me throughout the Epstein content, as well as recalling dots to be connected from the scientist saga that we've been focused on. So I've linked her Substack in the description box. Please go over there and support her, check her out, support her work, because what she's doing is some of the best investigative reporting I've seen in a while. And these days, I gotta be honest, it's pretty rare to find someone who tells the truth and does it directly and intelligently and backs it up with, you know, actual investigative work. So I spent a good 20 minutes staring at my computer screen at this point in writing the script. I was trying to figure out where to start because there's so much information and it's actually like a ball of yarn. It's all very tightly intertwined, and I'm just pulling the string to try and untangle it, but it's actually making it more tangled and more intertwined. And there were so many places I could have started, and I wanted to get everything kind of in, and I wanted to give it to you in the order that would be the most beneficial and where all the other things before would make sense. Hopefully I'm doing that. So let's start with the OSS, because why not? Let's start with, you know, the before World War II times, when the United States had no central foreign intelligence agency. Now, we obviously had the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover to stalk and harass us here at home, but there was no single civilian organization that was tasked with collecting foreign intelligence or running covert operations abroad. And it is believed that because of this gap, Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen. So 6 months after Pearl Harbor, in June of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt created the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. And by the end of World War II, the OSS had 13,000 personnel operating across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, collecting intelligence, sabotaging German installations, running propaganda, and training resistance fighters in occupied countries. You know, the stuff that they do. Now, the interesting thing is at the head of this agency, the OSS, was a man named Wild Bill Donovan. He was a wealthy World War I soldier turned Wall Street lawyer. He came from a rich family. He was kind of like a society guy. And that's kind of what makes the OSS different from anything that exists today. It's not the mission of the OSS, which was, intelligence and protecting against foreign entities, allegedly, whatever. It wasn't the mission, but it was who Wild Bill Donovan recruited to be in the OSS. So we know modern intelligence agencies that we're familiar with, like the CIA, NSA, etc., they're somewhat like professional, even very military. Like a lot of military people get recruited to go into the CIA. Usually the CIA and other entities like that, they're made up of people who go through background checks, take exams, they're trained. Wild Bill, he was grabbing people from all over the place. And he's like, you're in the OSS, you're in the OSS, you get an OSS. I mean, we're talking Ivy League professors, society figures from New York and Boston, journalists from major newspapers, Hollywood directors, Hollywood actors, scientists, professional athletes. The OSS actually had a nickname, Oh So Social, okay? So they called the OSS the Oh So Social during the war because so many of its officers were pulled directly from the American elite. And this was deliberate because Wild Bill Donovan believed that the work needing to be done, which was moving through foreign elite circles, recruiting diplomats, operating across borders, that required people who already belonged to those worlds. And I mean, if you think about it, it's actually not the worst plan because back in these times, people who came from wealthy families, they would usually go to boarding school abroad. So they'd speak multiple languages. They'd know how to play the piano. They'd have all of that polish and stuff that you would see and the ability, once again, to speak multiple languages. That was just kind of expected of people in those days if you came from a high reputation family. So it's not the worst idea. But it's just weird. It's like this ragtag group of high society people who probably would have not usually met. So it's like, oh, people from Hollywood, people from Boston, journalists. Very strange. So he takes all those people and he throws them overseas. And for 4 years, this collection of America's most well-connected young people worked together inside one of the most consequential secret organizations in our country's history. They trained together, they went behind enemy lines together, they trusted each other with the most sensitive operations of the war. They made relationships, very close ones. And when the war ended, those personal relationships and networks did not end with it. So Harry Truman abolished the OSS after the war. He didn't believe that we needed an intelligence agency like that during times of peace. But understand what I'm saying here because it's very important, not just to this, to everything. It's very interesting. All of these men from different spheres of influence, finance, universities, government, labs, the media, Hollywood, education, everything, they all went back to their respective worlds, but they did not go back as separate individuals. They went back as a network. The friendships forged in occupied France and in Yugoslavia became business partnerships in Manhattan and ranch holdings in New Mexico. The same families intermarried. The same children went to the same schools. The same young people were recommended into the same firms and the same films. And 2 years later, in 1947, Truman reluctantly signed the National Security Act, and then the CIA was created. And the CIA was staffed almost entirely with OSS veterans. Allen Dulles, Frank Wisner, William Casey, Every senior figure in the early CIA had served in the OSS. The new agency inherited the OSS's mission, but the OSS itself had already done something far more enduring. It had embedded a generation of trained intelligence men into the American social and economic establishment, where they stayed for generations. Probably still are there. Now that brings us to New Mexico, because the Manhattan Project and Los Alamos National Lab did not come after the OSS. They were created within a month of each other by the same president for the same war. The site for Los Alamos was selected by Robert Oppenheimer, who, as far as we know, was not in the OSS. As far as we know, but he was the same kind of person who would have been. He was a Berkeley physicist from a wealthy, educated New York family. He moved in academic, social, and political circles that overlapped with the OSS recruiting pool. And he'd spent his childhood vacations at his family's ranch near Pecos, New Mexico. So when he was asked to choose a remote, defensible, secure location for their new bomb laboratory, Oppenheimer suggested the Los Alamos Ranch School, and this was an existing elite boys boarding school sitting on a mesa above Santa Fe, so he knew about it because it was an elite boys boarding school. Now, the ranch school educated sons of the American upper class. The site was already a piece of the social geography of American elite formation. The Manhattan Project didn't just parachute into a random patch of New Mexico desert and be like, hey, this seems remote enough, let's do it. It landed on an already existing elite institution that the U.S. government simply took over. Now, additionally, the OSS was directly involved in protecting and supporting the Manhattan Project. They were very intertwined. But after the war, that same elite American class that had populated both the OSS and the Manhattan Project, they kind of flowed through into the institutions that took their place, right? So the scientists and academics working on the Manhattan Project stayed where they were, at Los Alamos and at Sandia, which had been created in 1945 to transition the atomic bomb from a lab project into a reliable mass-produced military weapon, right? So Los Alamos engineers the nuclear cores, we've talked about that before, and then Sandia does everything else, makes everything else. So the people at the Manhattan Project were like, well, we're here in New Mexico and we know stuff and we want to keep working on stuff. So the Manhattan Project may be done, but we're going to stay at Los Alamos and Sandia. And then OSS veterans went into the CIA, the State Department, law firms, journalism, and the defense industry that was rising around all of these new nuclear weapons programs in New Mexico. And this includes defense contractors that we've talked about before, companies that would become Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop. The same families intermarried, the same children went to the same schools, the same young people were recommended into the same firms. So by the 1960s, the nuclear industrial intelligence complex had become a single integrated system. The same people who had served in the OSS in the war, the same people who had worked on the Manhattan Project, and the same people who had staffed the early CIA were now senior partners at law firms, the executives at defense contractors, the editors at major newspapers, the trustees of universities, the face of your local nightly news, writing, directing, and acting in the films that you would be shown as, a regular person in America. And I mean, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. For a long time, and often during wartime and other times, the American government has used Hollywood as propaganda. And yeah, that's what I'm saying. All of these people who are doing everything that's like outward facing, everything that matters, reporting the news, writing our textbooks, deciding who gets to go to school, deciding how much it costs, deciding how much mortgage rates are going to go up, deciding how much money, federal money is spent on military, deciding where to drop the ball, all the people making the big decisions, the important decisions, and influencing how the rest of us think, feel, and act. They're all descendant from the same tightly knit group of people who were a part of the OSS and also the Manhattan Project. So an entire ecosystem that you wouldn't know about unless you were born into it or read into it. That was a spy joke. And a lot of them wanted to be around this New Mexico area. Los Alamos, Sandia, Kirtland Air Force Base, which is next to Sandia, a concentration of science and intelligence power. They all swam in the same pond, and they still do. So Zorro Ranch shares nearly 2 miles of fence line with the 81,000-acre San Cristobal Ranch, which was owned by Henry Singleton, a former OSS officer, founder of the Teledyne Global Defense and Aerospace Conglomerate, and co-trustee of Ronald Reagan's Blind Trust. If that sounds weird, like he maybe shouldn't be all of those things at once, you're correct. A president's blind trust is supposed to separate the president from personal financial interests by putting assets under the control of an independent trustee or trustees. So basically, the president does not know or direct how their assets are managed. The point is to reduce conflicts of interest. But this specific situation with Henry Singleton seems to have increased conflict of interest because the trustee may have influence over the president's financial holdings while also leading a company that could benefit from presidential or federal decisions, while also receiving federal defense contracts because Henry Singleton owned a military-industrial company, Teledyne. So according to the Los Angeles Times, in March of 1989, Teledyne pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges in the Pentagon three-wind corruption case. And they eventually had to agree to pay more than $4.3 million in fines, reimbursement, and court fees. So this all came as a result of this 3-year FBI investigation into systemic corruption in U.S. Department of Defense procurement. So basically, like the U.S. Department of Defense procurement, who's the United States deciding to buy from, all right? And listen, at this time, it was the largest defense procurement scandal in American history. It was big. It was a big deal. Now we're just like, corruption, scandal. Oh, what's next? We're used to it. So the investigation found a network in which Pentagon officials were selling inside bid information to defense contractors who then used that information to underbid their competitors and then win lucrative weapons contracts from the government. The contractors then funneled bribes back to the Pentagon officials who had given them the information and to the middleman consultants who were arranging the deals. Now, Teledyne was one of 7 major military contractors convicted, and Melvin Paisley, who was Ronald Reagan's hand-picked Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was convicted of accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes. What a dog, right? It's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes. Now, he pleaded guilty, served 4 years in federal prison, less than most people who did that would be serving, but okay. And the corruption involved Teledyne Electronics of Newbury Park, California. So this was one of Teledyne's defense divisions. What I'm saying is it's not like, oh, this was Henry Singleton himself. He's just the owner of the company. He's just the guy in charge of everything. So the Navy official at the center of all of this was Stuart Berlin, and he admitted to taking payoffs in exchange for leaking this confidential bid data that helped Teledyne win a $24 million Navy electronics contract. So the bribery was arranged through a middleman, a consultant who promised Berlin more than $25,000 in payments for his cooperation. Berlin admitted to taking the money. The consultant funneled the cash and information back and forth between the Navy Procurement Office and Teledyne. So Teledyne Electronics, they specialized in military electronics, especially components used in Navy systems. One of its major areas was guidance technology, the kind of technology that helps missiles and precision weapons know where they're going, where they are, when to strike. And this matters because Sandia National Laboratories was responsible for designing the non-nuclear parts of America's nuclear weapons, the systems that guide them, arm them, fuse them, and fire them. So Henry Singleton, who owned Teledyne, was basically sitting very, very close, I think like 37 miles away from Sandia National Labs, where he lived next door to Epstein. And he has this company that makes stuff for the military, the same exact stuff that Sandia is researching and investigating and making. And Henry Singleton, while being the owner of the company that was committing this fraud, he was also co-trustee of the president's, Ronald Reagan's, personal blind trust, meaning he held discretionary control over the president's financial assets. And at the same time, his company's bribing Reagan's own Assistant Secretary of the Navy to win defense contracts the federal government was paying for with taxpayer money. The president's blind trustee was running a company that was paying off the president's defense procurement officials. It seems like a conflict of interest. It seems bad. This seems bad, right? What's going on? Why was Henry Singleton so tight with Reagan? But I don't know. This all was noted at the time, by the way. It was raised by people who pay attention to this kind of stuff, the ethics watchdogs. but it was never fully investigated. Reagan was not personally implicated. Singleton himself was not personally charged. But the structural conflict of interest is one of the most extreme in modern American history. I mean, are we noticing a pattern here? Certain people get caught up in certain things. It gets brought to the surface. Pearls get clutched. Oh, why did Gary take all that money from Jeffrey Epstein? And he's like, I'm going to give it back. And they're like, okay, because then nothing ever happens. It's just dropped. When Jeffrey Epstein purchased Zorro Ranch in 1993, Henry Singleton was his neighbor and would remain his neighbor for the next 6 years until his death. Singleton's death, not Epstein's death. Now, during this period, we see that Jeffrey Epstein's personal address book, his little black book, contains an entry for San Cristobal Ranch. That's Henry Singleton's ranch. And this entry includes a modem number. Nothing else in the address book contains a modem number for any other entry. He's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names and numbers. Henry Singleton, or San Cristobal Ranch, the only entity in that book that had a modem number. Now, back then, a modem number wasn't just a phone number. It could be the number you dialed to connect directly to a computer system. So if someone had another person's modem number, they potentially had the address for a private digital doorway. Now, that didn't mean they could automatically walk through it just because they had the number. They might still need a password or a special setup, but it meant that they knew exactly where to knock. Hold that thought. When Henry Singleton passed away in 1999, San Cristobal Ranch passed to his heirs. And then in March of 2016, Epstein begins emailing Bryce Gordon. Bryce Gordon was one of the managers of Zorro Ranch. And Epstein and Gordon are discussing upgrading the communication system at Zorro for better security, like the internet, basically, right? And the reason being that there was a federal investigation against Epstein that was heating up at that point. Epstein knew by 2016 he was under investigation. Trust me, we can see it in the emails. He knew. So Epstein tells Bryce Gordon, we need to urgently move on figuring out how to, get a different internet service and like communication service here at Zorro Ranch. He made some suggestions. He was like, maybe a microwave radio network, because that's what they have at Epstein's Island in the Caribbean. So in a defense or intelligence context, a microwave radio network is often and could be used to move sensitive information quickly between bases, command centers, radar stations, labs, or government facilities without relying entirely or at all on public phones or physical cables, like no phone lines, no cables. Now, we can see in the DOJ files that Bryce Gordon emailed Epstein back. And he was like, hey, I talked to someone named Vito at San Cristobal Ranch, and I wanted to discuss with them sharing their already existing fiber network, right? So Henry Singleton and Cristobal Ranch, San Cristobal Ranch had a pretty extensive, expansive fiber system there already. And Jeffrey Epstein replied with, quote, please push, don't wait, call again, end quote. Clearly, this is very important to Jeffrey Epstein. He needs a different way of communicating from Zorro Ranch where it can't be tracked or seen. So once again, we talk about what he had already at Epstein Island, what kind of system he had, and then we talk about what kind of system he wanted to put at Zorro Ranch, and we see what's in his emails, and then people are like, oh, there's not a lot of, very implicating stuff in the emails, even though there is. But even though there is a lot of implicating stuff, I have to wonder what kind of things Jeffrey Epstein was passing over these other communication systems that are not trackable, because he could have passed over a bunch of things, files, photos, pictures, messages, whatever, through these communication systems that he had set up at Zorro Ranch in New Mexico and at Epstein Island in the Caribbean. So during that same time, Bryce Gordon was also talking to another employee at Epstein's Island in the Caribbean, and Gordon was asking for the technical specs of the microwave system they were already operating there, because apparently that was working great for them. Now listen, the fact that before these 2016 emails and before Henry Singleton's death, Epstein had a modem number for San Cristobal Ranch. This is actually very significant. When you had someone's modem number, what you really had was the address for a private point-to-point, computer-to-computer data link. If Epstein had Singleton's modem number in his personal address book, and Singleton had Epstein's, which would have been required for the link to work, then the two ranches had a direct computer-to-computer connection, not through the internet, not through email, not through any third-party service, a direct private data channel between two endpoints in central New Mexico running across phone lines, neither of them controlled, but that no third party would have had any reason to monitor. Okay? Until 2016, when Epstein's under federal investigation. Now, when I'm talking about this, these phone lines that they would be using, that's what the modem would be for, right? It would go through phone lines, but once again, yes, somebody could see what you were doing if they were looking, but at that point, nobody was looking. Nobody was looking, but then Epstein's being looked at by the feds. So he's like, we need a different system. We can't use the modem-to-modem thing we're using anymore. And what could you transfer with this modem-to-modem kind of connection, this keyhole that you'd have between computers? Anything. We're talking files, photographs, videos, documents, encrypted data. None of it would ever touch the public internet. There would be no log or history to track it. They could have also been running a private message system. They could also back up or mirror each other's data. Okay? So keep in mind what I mean here. They have data on their computers at their respective ranches, and Epstein's like, oh shit, a raid's happening, or I think a raid's happening, or something's going to happen. I want you to basically take a mirror of everything I have here so I can trash it and erase it, and then when the police leave, I'll take it back, right? So data coming in from somewhere else, like, I don't know, a nearby national lab, could also be routed first to one ranch and then forwarded across the modem link to another. So let's say Henry Singleton, who was a former OSS, tight with Reagan, running a military defense and aerospace company. Let's say he had somebody inside Los Alamos or somebody inside of Sandia, and they were funneling things to him, and then he wanted to get those things to Jeffrey Epstein so that Jeffrey Epstein could get those things to whoever he needed to get things for, like a different country maybe. That would be very easily done and transferred without using email, without doing anything that anybody would ever be able to see or track unless you became the subject of a 2016 federal investigation, and then you'd have to find a different way to communicate without using the modems. And also, you look at Henry Singleton, like I said, former OSS, running a huge company, tight with Ronald Reagan. And then you look at Jeffrey Epstein, convicted sex offender. What could they be exchanging through that modem link? Would it be something more up Singleton's alley, like intelligence-wise, science-wise, government secrets-wise? Or would it be something more of Epstein's interest, which we know what Epstein's interests are? Maybe a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. Maybe they were both getting something out of each other. Ultimately, it appears maybe that's why Jeffrey Epstein had been able to convince Henry Singleton to set up this modem connection and send him things and share information and intel and intelligence with him, because maybe Epstein had something on Singleton that Singleton didn't want to get out. Ultimately, it appears that Gordon Bryce and Jeffrey Epstein decided to go a different route, and in July of 2016, they got an email from a company called Micronet Communications. And Micronet Communications was like, congratulations, your applications have been granted by the FCC. So these licenses authorized the operation of a bi-directional military-grade microwave radio communications system with one antenna at Zorro Ranch and the other at the Sandia Crest Tower, the public infrastructure complex on the peak of the Sandia Mountains east of Albuquerque. So that meant Zorro Ranch and Jeffrey Epstein had a federally licensed microwave radio system that was built to military and industrial grade specifications, operating between his New Mexico compound and a public tower with line of sight visibility to both Sandia Labs and Los Alamos. And his own personal ranch manager, Bryce Gordon, was listed as the federally responsible party. Now, it's worth talking about. Bryce Gordon is still listed as the federally responsible party, even though Zorro Ranch has changed hands. And the person that Zorro Ranch has changed hands into, or to, that person or family or group of people, we will talk about them, they kept the FCC licenses for this microwave tower. It's almost like the torch is passed on to the next person. but we will talk more about that. So at the end of March 2016, Epstein had been presented with 3 options for a new internet connection at Zorro Ranch. The first was tapping into Henry Singleton's and San Cristobal's fiber network, which we already talked about. The second was find a property within 5 to 10 miles that was adjacent to live CenturyLink gigabit fiber. You would lease or buy the property, put in power, install an antenna, and then, you would have like a relay station from there for internet. And the man writing the email was a rancher named William, and he said, quote, "This is what I ended up doing on our ranch," end quote. William actually is not just a rancher, but hopefully we'll get to that. So the final option was the Sandia Crest option, which William described as being the most expensive, the most difficult to access, and although the 5 gigahertz radios were rated out to 100 miles and 1 gig or 1 gigabyte, he said he thinks they would be lucky to only get 30% bandwidth. And he said, quote, "It would take incredibly expensive industrial/military grade equipment to mitigate significant signal degradation," end quote. So as we know, Epstein ended up choosing the Sandia Crest option. He replied back that it's silly. They don't need 1 gig. They're shooting Dragon Wave further. Now, since I am technologically challenged, I don't know what this stuff meant. I had to do some learning. So basically, the William guy, the rancher, he's telling Epstein, listen, the Sandia Crest radios would be rated at 1 gig, but because the distance, which was 27 miles, was very long, and because all the difficult access points, they'd be lucky to get 30% of that. So William was essentially saying Sandia Crest is too far away. You'd be spending huge money on military-grade equipment and only getting a third of this equipment's rated capacity in practice. This is a bad deal. Like, it's not the best option. Now, in response, Epstein wasn't arguing with William or negotiating the cost. He wasn't mad about how much it was going to cost. He wasn't mad about the loss of bandwidth. He was actually saying that the bandwidth doesn't matter to him. Epstein is saying, that's silly. I don't need a lot of capacity. Even 30% of 1 gigabyte per second is fine. Even less is fine. Now, that's an extraordinary statement for someone about to spend a fortune on military-grade communications equipment. The only reason you would spend that much on infrastructure that's this exotic is normally because you need huge bandwidth that civilian infrastructure can't provide. So if bandwidth isn't the reason, then what is? Well, look at it this way. Let's say you're shipping a package across the country, and you have 2 options. You can use regular mail, you can send it FedEx or UPS, and you're going to do this because it's like a card for your grandma, and it's cheap, fast, convenient, and you know the driver might see your package, and the postal authorities have records, but it's just like a card for your grandma, so it's like whatever. It's going to be the cheapest, it's going to be the fastest, grandma's going to get it in a few days, and I don't really care if the person taking my package knows that I'm sending a card to my grandma. Or if you're sending a package, and it's a little bit more important than a card to your grandma, you could build a private armored truck that drives only between your house and one specific destination where that package is going. It's definitely going to cost a fortune. It's going to cost more than FedEx or UPS. It's definitely going to be slower because you still have to build the truck, and then the truck's not going to drive as fast as, UPS can fly things there or whatever. But absolutely no one outside of you and the person that the truck is going to will be able to see the package, be able to intercept it, or even know that it exists. You're not paying for speed or convenience, you're paying for privacy. And Epstein name drops Dragon Wave, which is apparently what they used on Epstein's Island. And it's definitely not consumer equipment. It's carrier-grade, military-specific gear. Its defining feature is hardware-level encryption built into the radio layer itself, meaning that the data is scrambled at the physical level below where any standard networking monitoring tool could see it. So combined with hardware-bound authentication, like with a computer that's hooked up to it that also has levels of protection, it basically would make intercepting anything traveling over that communication system effectively impossible. Now, Sandia Crest for Epstein and Zorro Ranch, it wasn't a valuable location because it was close. It wasn't close. It was 27 miles away. The top of Sandia Crest is valuable to Epstein because it's at the top of a mountain with a line of sight visibility to half of central New Mexico, including Sandia National Labs, Los Alamos, Kirtland Air Force Base. Okay, because I have said this before, I wholeheartedly believe that Jeffrey Epstein was doing some intelligence work, a lot. And the why and the who may still be fuzzy, and I may not be wanting to point fingers just yet, but I think he was, and I think his neighbor, Henry Singleton, was too. And you know who else was? Robert Maxwell, the father of Epstein's #1 lady, and the very same person who gave his daughter Ghislaine the contacts inside the world of education and science in New Mexico and elsewhere that she would eventually pass on to Jeffrey Epstein, including the Santa Fe Institute. And in fact, it's not just Robert Maxwell, it's not just Ghislaine, it's not just Jeffrey Epstein, it's others in Maxwell's family, it's others in Ghislaine's family, and I believe that there's plenty of proof to back all of this up. So if Robert Maxwell was definitely a spy, which I think 1,000,000 quadrillion % he was. And his daughter knew, and his daughter got contacts that she passed along to Jeffrey Epstein, including the heads of the Santa Fe Institute. Well, we have a lot to talk about here. After spending the last few weeks on this, there is not a doubt in my mind that Robert Maxwell was on some spy shit. I have the receipts. Jeffrey Epstein was on some spy shit. There's multiple things happening with Jeffrey Epstein. He's doing horrible things to women and to girls. And he's also working on some level with intelligence. And I think that there was a lot of people in the United States who also worked in the government, who also worked in intelligence for our country, who knew about what he was doing and let him do it because he had stuff on them. Even the people who constructed and designed the Zorro Ranch mansion have weird connections to the military-industrial complex. I mean, pretty direct connections. But all of that, all of that, along with the Robert Maxwell connections that run quite deep, we'll have to wait until next time. We're also going to talk about who owns Zorro Ranch now, what they're planning to do with it. And we're going to talk about certain claims that have been made about things that happened at Zorro Ranch that kind of coincide and align with what we've already talked about. But yes. Oh, we're also going to talk about the weird science and medical stuff that Jeffrey Epstein was interested in, that he was actually funding the Santa Fe Institute because he wanted to be a part of it in some way. So there's a lot of stuff we still have to talk about, but this video is going to be long enough. I will make sure the next video doesn't come out in too much of a length between this one. But let me know what you think in the comment section. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Like this video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Comment if you haven't already to let me know what you're thinking about this. And if you have any questions or you need me to clarify something I said in this video, because I know I talked for a long time and I know I kind of went off. Sometimes if you need me to clarify anything, let me know in the comment section. I'll try to do that for you. But until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I will see you very, very soon. Bye.